It is a common misconception that we live in a democracy. And while that description suffices when comparing our system of government to the world's various fascist and socialist autocracies, most of which actually do hold entirely predetermined elections from time to time, but our American government is actually a representative republic. It's a republic because it's a union of 50 states. It was the republic that Lincoln strove to preserve through 4 bloody years of civil war. The representative part refers to the process by which we elect individuals to vote on our behalf at the local, state, and federal levels, as opposed to voting on each of those issues ourselves. Aside from various ballot initiatives, you and I don't weigh in on the multitude of decisions that our government must make to function directly. Our representatives do that for us, at least in theory. Talking about representation, because Paul's going to be talking about representation this morning. So let's take a look at Romans chapter 5, starting in verse 12, where we left off last week. It says this: "Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man." Paul begins this paragraph's focus on our 2 representatives by making an allusion to the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3. In that episode, which of course is well known in its infamy, both Adam and Eve chose to reject the limitation put on them directly by God in favor of autonomy and the secret knowledge promised by the serpent. That choice produced first shame, then fear, then judgment, as God banished the pair from the garden. Much of the rancorous debate of modern church history revolving around the interpretation of Genesis 1 through 3 is actually not at issue in how Paul is using the story here. Whether or not God created the world about 6,000 years ago during 6 24-hour days, or if God created the world over billions of years using evolutionary processes, we still end up with one man, Adam, acting as humanity's representative at the beginning of recorded human history. Even if we can't all agree about how far back that history should be set in time. However they got there, it was God who made them, as God made everything, and God who placed them in the garden to fulfill their role of stewardship over it. Their failure is the entrance of sin into humanity's story. Although sin itself had existed since the rebellion of Satan and the downfall from heaven of he and his followers, our concern here is how sin became a universal aspect of the human condition. Paul says sin entered the world through one man and death through sin. With the entrance of sin, that is, rebellion against God, into the story of humanity, we also have, by necessity, the concurrent appearance of mortality in the form of death. Why is that a necessity? It's quite simple. God is the maker, giver, and sustainer of life. All life. To turn away from God is therefore to turn away from life and toward death. Because sin and death and darkness and the like, all of the things under the larger umbrella of evil, do not have their own existence, but are merely an absence of obedience and life and light and righteousness. They all go together. It's a package deal. Whenever anyone becomes disconnected from God, as did Adam and Eve with the dramatic ejection from the garden, death is there to greet them. And then Paul continues and says, "And in this way death came to all people because all sinned." This phrase here describes the ever-widening effect of that disobedience, typically referred to as original sin. and how that one act by our representative ancestors became a universal fact of all humanity through every generation. This is a key question for us. Do we all share in mortality because of our connection to Adam and Eve ancestrally, as we would other traits inherited from our parentage, like our eye color or our height? Or do we all share in mortality because we all, like Adam and Eve, have chosen to follow in their rebellious footsteps? This may feel like a chicken or an egg question, or maybe 6 of one, half dozen of the other, which is a phrase I apparently use too often, my wife says, but oh well. Because they're both true. There is a lineage-based connection, and we all have sinned. Paul does not exclude one and focus on the other. This is, in fact, a both-and situation, not an either-or. That question, could a human being live a life without sin, is always going to be hypothetical because we know it will never happen. The virgin birth is an asterisk in this conversation, of course, because Jesus eliminates the question by not having a human father, and of course by living a life free of sin. So how then does whatever part of our sinful nature that is inherited pass from one generation to the next? Let me take you back a moment into church history. We talked about this in part 1 of my seminar. Unfortunately, that is the response of St. Augustine to this question. For all his wisdom in other areas, and St. Augustine is a giant in church history, Augustine put the blame for original sin going from one generation to the next into the sexual act itself. He talked about it as a biological process of sin passing from one generation to the next. For the next 1,500 years since him, the church has been led then in some ways and on some levels to view sex and sexuality as inherently dirty, even within its God-ordained boundaries of marriage, where it ought to be a mutual blessing between husband and wife. It's not Paul's purpose here to answer the how and when aspect of original sin's path from Adam to everyone else. Simply, he chooses to state that it has indeed spread to us all. Perhaps we're better off leaving it that. Because the path of elevating lifelong celibacy and virginity, which was the result of Augustine's view, making it somehow more spiritual and less tainted than marital intimacy, hasn't helped the church. It has, in fact, led to a number of poor decisions and emphases that we still collectively battle against to this day. Focusing on biology in relation to original sin is, unfortunately, a red herring. So let us continue on. Paul says, to be sure, sin was in the world before the law was given. One of the reasons why men like St. Augustine have speculated as to how sin might pass from one generation to the next is the obvious truth that sin has been pervasive throughout human history as something that transcends factors like culture and parentage and upbringing, right? Sin is everywhere. It's most definitely, as Paul calls it here, in the world. In the centuries between Adam and Eve, God had not yet given his law. Sin, to be sure, was still present. Read the text of the scriptures and the accounts of the patriarchs before Moses. What do you see? Murder, greed, rape, pride, gossip, idolatry. Yeah, sin was still there before Moses. Paul says, but sin is not charged against anyone's account where there is no law. The sin is certainly there. But did the people know what they were doing was wrong? Taken in a vacuum, this phrase might be thought to say ignorance is bliss. Don't tell anybody what's wrong, because then it won't be held against them. But context, of course, always matters, especially in Scripture. The sinful conduct was immoral both before the law was given and after it. Conscience is sufficient to establish that. We can go back to Romans 1 to learn about that. What is added by the giving of the law is a second element, an increased accountability, because those who know specifically what God requires, what he approves of and condemns, have the additional question of whether they will be obedient to God, or will they reject his law and rebel against him. Let me put it in terms of a parenting analogy, because these often help. A parent will still punish a child on the basis of, you knew better than to, right? You should have known that, right? You don't lay out as a parent every possible scenario your child could get into, because you can't possibly. They will think of something that you never imagined, or something you forgot you did when you were a kid. That works too. But as a parent, are you not typically more upset, more bothered by the outright defiance of them breaking a rule that you specifically set? About a curfew or some such thing. They specifically defy that. They were doing wrong in both cases. But in one case, they were also defying you, your authority, your parenting of them. That's similar to what the law is doing in this scenario. Verse 14, nevertheless, death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin by breaking a command, as did Adam, who is the pattern of the one to come. Death reigned. Those who broke the law died. Those who sinned apart from knowledge of the law died. Death was common to all, both those who ignored their conscience and those who disobeyed when given direct knowledge of what God requires. Adam was given one specific command and failed to keep it. The law of Moses is a collection of very many commands, and those who were part of that old covenant were tasked with obeying each one of them, and nobody was able to do so. So while some broke specific commands, while others with less revelation available to them defied their God-given conscience, the result was the same: death. All followed in Adam's footsteps. The pattern of failure spread from the original one to the many who followed. Verse 15, but the gift is not like the trespass. For if the many died by the trespass of the one man, how much more did God's grace and the gift that came by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, overflow to the many? Learning about the spread of original sin to all of humanity is depressing, given that we have no way to prevent it and no way to reverse it. Thankfully, the solution to this is not up to us. God planned from the very beginning to undo this calamity by overcoming this scourge with a more potent and permanent remedy. The one man who could accomplish this impossible task is, of course, Jesus Christ. Through him, the grace of God would flow once more from the one to the many, but this time bringing life, not death, hope, not despair. Nor can the gift of God be compared with the result of one man's sin. The judgment followed one sin and brought condemnation, but the gift followed many trespasses and brought justification. Original sin was the pebble that started an avalanche as generation after generation, plus an ever-increasing human population, added to the growing mountain of human sin. And there to oppose it all, standing as it were at the bottom of this mountain with this giant avalanche of sin coming his way, to reverse its effect, to offer hope to those who had lived before. And don't forget, there's another mountain of sin coming from all the people that have not yet lived, who will live, who are living now or in the future, is one man, Jesus. Do you ever stop and consider the math? You ever try to ballpark the math in your head? How many sins were laid upon his shoulders at the cross? It's mind-boggling. In one level, we can't calculate even remotely because we have no real clue how many more years are there in human history. How many more people will come to Christ through the blood of the Lamb before that final judgment? We can't possibly guess at the number. But we know this much. Billions of sins was a number that passed by long ago. Trillions will end up being closer to the final tally. And not trillions singular, it's trillions by now for sure. There's 6 billion people on this planet. And, well, closer to 7 actually, I think the latest numbers were. But as it is with government debt, once we start talking about billions and trillions, our imagination fails to capture the scale of such numbers, right? FYI, in case you're wondering, a trillion is 1,000 billion. It's a lot. For if by the trespass of the one man, death reigned through that one man, how much more will those who receive God's abundant provision of grace and the gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ? If what Adam, a mere man, did began the process of bringing death to all, just imagine what Jesus, the Son of God, can do in bringing life in response. Paul likes this phrase. You've probably noticed it as we've been studying this part of Romans. How much more? He likes saying, how much more? Especially when he's talking about the grace of God compared to something else. God's grace is always much more impactful, much more available, much more wondrous than we can readily put into words. So Paul just leaves us with that sense of wonder. How much more indeed? Verse 18, consequently, just as one trespass resulted in condemnation for all people, so also one righteous act resulted in justification and life for all people. There is symmetry to God's redemptive plan, how it flows from the one righteous man to the many sinners, counteracting how sin itself had spread from one to many. There really was no other option than doing it this way. Humanity was never going to solve its own rebellious nature. There was never going to be a widespread solution working in each person. It was impossible. And there was ever only one being outside of humanity capable of stepping into humanity, yet retaining the power and purity to rescue us. God Himself in the person of Jesus Christ. And the last verse, for just as through the disobedience of the one man the many were made sinners, so also through the obedience of the one man the many will be made righteous. The solution to disobedience could only be obedience. The solution to sin could ever only be righteousness. Evil is overcome with good. So let us give glory, honor, and praise to Jesus Christ, who took upon Himself, as only He could, the task of being the one righteous man that our species needed to reverse the damage flowing outward from humanity's original sin to all of us. In Christ, many will be made whole again, justified by His gift of righteousness. 2 thoughts of application to help you remember what this text is getting to. Number 1, original sin flowed from the one to the many, themselves all sinners, and death with it. But secondly, and for us much more importantly, justification and reconciliation can also flow from the one to the many, because Jesus is righteous, and with it will come life.